Let me tell you something about the way your mind works that nobody has probably ever said to you directly. The thing you experience as a problem, the brain that will not quiet down, the thoughts that keep running after everyone else has moved on, the inability to just switch off and stop analyzing everything is not a malfunction. It is a specific and well-documented cognitive profile, one that the psychology research has been mapping for decades. One that has costs that are real and documented, and capacities that are equally real and equally documented. And the reason most deep thinkers spend so much of their lives experiencing their own minds as a burden rather than an asset is not because the burden is the whole story. It is because nobody ever gave them the other half of it. That is what this is. 1. Your brain has an unusually active default mode network. This is where the science starts, and it is the foundational finding that explains almost everything else about how the deep thinker's mind works. The default mode network is a system of interconnected brain regions that activates when the mind is not focused on an external task. When you are daydreaming, when you are mind-wandering, when you are doing nothing in particular. In deep thinkers, the research finds something different. The default mode network remains more active even during focused tasks. The internal processing does not pause because the external demand has arrived. Both run simultaneously. Marcus Reichel's foundational neuroimaging research at Washington University, which first mapped the default mode network, and the subsequent work by Randy Buckner and colleagues found that individuals with more active default mode networks showed greater capacity for complex associative thinking, for making connections between things that are not obviously connected, for the kind of insight that arrives not through deliberate analysis, but through the spontaneous collision of ideas that a continuously active internal processing system generates. The brain that never fully switches off is not running inefficiently, it is running continuously. And the continuity of that processing is the source of the depth that defines the deep thinker's relationship with ideas, with problems, and with experience. 2. You think in connections rather than categories. Most people process information categorically. They encounter something new, assign it to a familiar category, and move on. The processing is efficient, it is fast, and it produces a surface-level understanding that is sufficient for most purposes. The deep thinker does not process this way. They process associatively. Every new piece of information activates connections to existing knowledge across multiple domains simultaneously. Every idea generates a network of related ideas. Every experience connects to memories, to patterns, to implications that extend far beyond the immediate situation. This is what the cognitive psychology literature calls integrative complexity, the capacity to consider multiple dimensions of an issue simultaneously and to integrate those dimensions into a coherent but genuinely complex understanding. Research by Peter Sudfeld and Philip Tetlock on integrative complexity found that higher integrative complexity was associated with better long-term decision-making, with greater ability to navigate genuinely ambiguous situations, and with the kind of thinking that produces novel solutions to problems that simpler cognitive approaches cannot reach. But it also produces something less comfortable. The deep thinker cannot encounter a simple question without seeing its complications, cannot hear a confident assertion without noticing its exceptions, cannot accept a clean narrative without being aware of the messy reality it is simplifying. This is not being difficult. This is a cognitive style that is oriented toward accuracy over comfort, toward genuine understanding over efficient categorization, and it is cognitively expensive in ways that the person running it often experiences as exhausting without fully understanding why. 3. You have an unusually strong relationship with meaning. The psychology of deep thinking is inseparable from the psychology of meaning-making. And the research on this connection is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of this cognitive profile. Roy Baumeister's foundational work on meaning and human motivation identified 4 core components of the need for meaning: purpose, value, efficacy, and self-worth. And the research consistently finds that deep thinkers weight these components more heavily than the general population. That the need to understand not just what is happening, but why it is happening, what it signifies, What it means in the broader context of their understanding of the world is not optional for this cognitive profile. It is structural. This produces a specific relationship with experience that the people around a deep thinker often find hard to understand. The deep thinker does not move on from things quickly, not because they are stuck, because they are still extracting meaning from them, still finding the layers that are there to be found, still following the implications of what happened into territory that the person who has already moved on never reached. Viktor Frankl's observation that the human mind moves toward meaning with the same drive that it moves toward survival describes the deep thinker's experience with unusual precision. The brain that never switches off is a brain that is continuously in search of meaning, continuously finding it, and continuously discovering that the meaning it has found points toward more meaning that has not yet been found. That is not a burden. That is the most distinctly human cognitive activity there is. 4. You experience emotions with unusual depth and intensity. This is the piece that causes the most difficulty in everyday life, and the one that the research is most important about framing correctly. Elaine Aron's research on the highly sensitive person and the broader literature on sensory processing sensitivity consistently finds deep thinking and emotional depth as co-occurring traits, not because one causes the other exactly, because they share a neurological foundation in the depth of cognitive processing that characterizes both. The same processing depth that produces richer intellectual engagement with ideas produces richer emotional engagement with experience. The same default mode network activity that generates more connections between ideas generates more connections between experiences and their emotional significance. The same integrative complexity that makes the deep thinker see more dimensions of a problem makes them feel more dimensions of an experience. They experience a fuller range of emotional response to the same events that others process more narrowly. The research on emotional granularity, the ability to identify and distinguish between specific emotional states with precision, by Lisa Feldman Barrett and colleagues found that individuals with higher emotional granularity showed better emotional regulation, better interpersonal functioning, and greater resilience in the face of difficult experience. The deep thinker who has developed language for their emotional depth, who has learned to identify and work with the richness of their emotional experience rather than being overwhelmed by it, has an emotional intelligence that is built on the same neurological foundation as their intellectual depth, and one of the most consistently reported by people who identify with it. The same integrative processing that makes deep thinkers see the connections between ideas makes them see the gaps between what people say and what they mean, between the stated position and the underlying motivation, between the surface presentation and the reality underneath it. Research on cognitive load and social processing, and the broader literature on what is sometimes called mentalizing, the capacity to model other people's mental states, finds that individuals with high integrative complexity show more accurate social perception, more reliable identification of inconsistency, more precise reading of the gap between explicit communication and implicit meaning. This is not cynicism. It is pattern recognition applied to social reality. The same cognitive machinery that notices the exception to the rule in an argument notices the exception to the stated position in a person's behavior. And it produces a specific experience in social environments that most deep thinkers recognize immediately. The discomfort with small talk, not because they are socially incapable, but because small talk, by design, operates at a surface level that their processing depth is constantly moving beneath. The discomfort with inauthenticity, not as a moral position, but as a perceptual experience. The awareness of the gap between presented and actual reality is simply always there, whether they want it to be or not. This makes deep thinkers unusually valuable in environments that require accurate social perception, and unusually uncomfortable in environments that require the performance of not noticing what they notice. 6. Your mind is solving problems you are not consciously aware of. This is the finding that I think is most important for understanding why the deep thinker's brain never fully switches off, and the one that reframes the experience most significantly. The research on unconscious thought theory, developed by Ap Dijksterhuis at the University of Amsterdam, produced one of the most surprising findings in the psychology of decision-making and problem-solving. For complex problems with multiple variables and considerations, the kind of genuinely difficult decisions that cannot be resolved through simple analysis, unconscious thought processes outperform conscious deliberation. The mind working below the threshold of awareness, integrating information and generating solutions without the limiting factor of conscious attention's narrow bandwidth, produces better outcomes than the mind trying to consciously work through the same complexity. The brain that never fully switches off is not failing to rest. It is working continuously on the problems that its owner has not consciously put on the agenda, processing the unresolved questions. Simple problems, best solved consciously. Complex problems, best solved by providing the relevant information and then allowing the unconscious processing to run without interference. The deep thinker, whose brain never switches off, is running this process continuously, not because they cannot stop, because their cognitive system is doing the most sophisticated work it is capable of in the space that other minds leave empty. Here is what I want you to take from this. The psychology of deep thinking is not primarily a story about difficulty. It is a story about a specific cognitive profile that has been running without adequate description for most of the people who possess it. The active default mode network, the associative rather than categorical processing, the structural relationship with meaning. These are not the characteristics of a mind that is broken. They are the characteristics of a mind that is running at a depth that most cognitive environments are not designed for, that most social norms are not calibrated for, that most productivity systems are not built to accommodate. The deep thinker who has spent their life being told to switch off, to stop overthinking, to not take things so seriously, to just enjoy themselves without analyzing everything, has been receiving feedback calibrated for a different cognitive profile, advice designed for a mind that works differently from theirs. The research is not telling you to think less deeply, needs conditions that allow it to function as the asset it is, rather than the burden it can feel like when it has no map. You now have more of that map than you did 10 minutes ago, and the brain that never fully switches off already knows what to do with it.